Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Talksport as we sort of clatter headlong into 2012, looking back at 2011 and the economic news from around the globe. It's pretty depressing, really. I suppose some might say the Eurozone crisis has dominated the news in the last part of the year, but at the beginning part of the year, China becoming the world's second largest economy, I suppose, might have been seen as quite significant.
It certainly was. However, it's one of those things where it basically got ahead of itself. The Chinese economy grew massively for 20 years, and as far as I'm concerned, this year was the year it peaked. And the vast amount of property development in China has been its growth area. It's also its downfall, as indeed we've seen right across the world, in Ireland, in Spain, and in other countries.
Right.
And to put a funny on it, as it were, you can see the Great Wall of China from space. I'm telling you, you'll be able to see the property crash from Alpha Centauri.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we're already seeing some of these news stories about kind of ghost cities that have been built that nobody lives in and nobody can afford to buy. Is that partly because their kind of market, if you like, the West, has dried up and that people just haven't got any more money to spend on Chinese goods?
Partially. It's all about politics in China. It is, of course, an undemocratic communist state, even though it's full of capitalism, or crony capitalism to be exact. And the reality is that the Politburo knows that if the people don't have an income, they're just going to revolt. And there's 1.25 billion of them that they've got to feed. And they have been doing exactly what every major politician has been doing in the West and in China and in India. They have been kicking the can down the line for as long as they can so that it doesn't all collapse on their watch governor. And the reality is that next year, 2012, is when the existing Politburo retires. And next year, or possibly 2013, we're going to have a new 5-year economic plan. And I can tell you, the growth expectation will be significantly lower than the 10% per annum growth that has been in the 5-year plan over the last 5 years. And I'll tell you something else. China today is probably in recession, outright recession, not slowing growth, but probably in outright recession. House prices are falling 30, 50, 70% in some places, and it's just going to create havoc. There's not going to be anywhere near the development that there's been. There's going to be mass protest. There's going to be mass bankruptcies. And from second largest economy in the world, I think it's going to experience what Japan has experienced in the last 20, 25 years, which also had phenomenal growth for a few decades. And look what's happened to Japan these last couple of decades. And remember, in the 1980s, Japan was the country that could do no economic wrong. And China is simply taking over because they've made all the same massive mistakes.
Interesting. Now, when you sat in your armchair this time last year, and you and I have spoken quite frequently over the course of this year, did you really envisage the world's economies and the European economies in particular kind of rolling into this kind of never-ending series of crises as we've seen over the past few months?
No, I didn't foresee a never-ending series of crises. To be entirely straightforward, what I foresaw was the biggest economic collapse in history. 2008, Mike, was simply the hors d'oeuvre. 2012 or maybe 2013 will be the main course, and it will be even bigger, the crash, than 2008, because then you had companies going bust. Now you have countries going bust.
And as far as the Euro rescue package goes, and we've had various, I suppose, signals from an awful lot of countries within the Eurozone and within the 27 as well, saying we're not going to sign up to this. And Cameron maybe was right to put his hand up and say, hold on a minute, we don't really want to get involved in this. I mean, that's still very far from being sorted out, isn't it?
It certainly is, and whether or not they sign up to it is really not the point, because it's all about the level of debt that is held in society, held by banks that they loaned to governments that can never be repaid. And whether they sign up to new treaties or not, we're still going to have a global economy which has $220 trillion of debt. Let me tell you, only about a decade ago, it was $80 trillion of debt. The fact is, we've had 2 to 3% per annum growth in Europe for the past 10 years, and we've had 10% per annum debt growth. Thus, we are now finally at the end of the line. And as far as I'm concerned, you say, but looking back to 2011, where it seemed to be talking about 2012 here, as far as I'm concerned, 2012 is when it really all falls apart. We're going to see the EU fall apart. We're going to see the euro fall apart. We're going to see the stock market fall apart. We're going to see the global economy in the biggest recession ever, bearing in mind that we only had the biggest recession ever 3 years ago.
Well, according to Christine Lagarde, who's the new chair of the IMF, of course, she says that we may fall into the biggest recession since the 1930s. Yeah. Is that something that anybody could recognise? I mean, I obviously wasn't around in the 30s, neither were you. I mean, I don't know what that was like. It doesn't seem quite as bad as that now, does it?
Well, if you were Greek or Italian or Irish, you wouldn't be asking that question. It's far, far worse. The reason why we are in a 20 or 30 year depression, which started, as I say, a few years ago, is because whereas in the 1930s, that was the result of the fallout of by then, the biggest debt bubble in history. You know, the roaring 20s, the second half of the 20s, it was all about debt. The problem is, by 2008, we have debt globally far bigger per capita than we had in 1929. Right. Thus, we are in a 20 to 30 year depression if they don't alter their policies. And the chances are they're not going to alter their policies. They're going to print money ad infinitum. It's going to create super, or God help us, hyperinflation, whilst we have major, major unemployment, that the like of which we haven't seen since the 18th century. It's just going to be so big, most people can't even comprehend, can't even imagine how big it's going to be.
And all of this sort of culture of debt, I suppose, if you like, was presumably encouraged not just by governments, but by the people who were advising those governments, the economists of the world who were saying, yeah, everything's going to be fine. As Gordon Brown famously said, we have abolished the boom and bust cycle. We're only now going to be booming. I mean, there must have been an awful lot of people that believed that.
They believed their own hubris. They believed in their own because of their own arrogance. Also, they believed because it paid them to believe it. The vast majority of economic advisors to governments work for banks, and the business of banks is to lend money. And they were given the authority to create money out of thin air by printing it electronically and lending it to whomever came along and asked to borrow it. And indeed, they also came up with schemes that pushed debt onto people and governments and businesses. And governments loved it. They lapped it up because when you have rising debt, you generally have a rising economy. And that's all fine and well in the relatively short term, but successive politicians, you talk about Gordon Brown, and the guy is a total clown, but he is an incredibly dangerous guy, as is Ed Balls, basically his successor. But not just the Labour guys and Tony Blair. Margaret Thatcher, she is the one who created Big Bang and deregulated the city, deregulated lending, and John Major continued it, and David Cameron is continuing it. They're all in the same boat. They're all doing the same thing. They're all supporting the city because it suits their purpose. The longer they can continue to keep the charade going, the longer they stay in office. And the reality is that successive governments have sold our children down the river. The interesting thing is, after 20 or 30 years, the children are us.
Yes, it may well be a little bit more than interesting. But, I mean, I suppose making the city the focal point of the economy and churning out billions and billions and billions of pounds and reaping certain amounts of that in revenue into taxes and stuff like that is all fine and dandy as long as the people running the banking system actually know what they're doing. But the worry is that they don't know what they're doing.
Well, au contraire, monsieur, they knew exactly what they were doing. They were feathering their own nests. Everyone knows about their vast, humongous earnings. We're talking mega money, beyond Premiership footballer salaries, vast amounts of money, and to the entire detriment of everyone else. In the short term, as I say, no doubt, it helps because people have jobs, and the economy has an engine. The problem, however, is that the fallout is going to last at least a generation, and it's going to be far bigger than the benefits that accrued for the 10 or 20 years. And people need to get to grips with one simple reality. The UK, per capita, is the most indebted nation on the planet. We have in this country nearly 10 times our economy as debt. Never in the history of economics has a country ever got out of such a situation. It's literally impossible.
Is it time to emigrate then, Jonathan, do you think?
Where would you go? Literally, there is practically nowhere on earth that's going to miss out on the economic fallout, because at least in the 1930s, it was very insular. It was the West, whereas now it's global. Perhaps you could go to countries that push out commodities and are heavy in agriculture, because these are going to be the growth areas, because people are still going to need to eat, obviously. They're still going to need to heat and light their homes and fuel their vehicles. However, what you won't need, I guess, are many more tables and chairs and clothes and games and computer games and all that kind of stuff. The things that we need are the things that are going to still be around, that are still going to grow. The things that you want are going to be less so. So maybe the countries that push out the commodities, they're the ones to perhaps go to, because they will have less of a fallout than everywhere else.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, I appreciate you taking the time once again to talk to us. I'm sure we'll talk in the new year when some other development moves us, as you say, slightly further into the long grass or the short grass or the edge of the cliff or whatever it is. But we shall try and have a happy new year in the meantime.
Well, and to you too. I think people listening to this need to get real. They need to reduce their debts by whatever means they can, and they need to somehow retain their incomes. They may feel okay just now if they're working, But I think unemployment's going to soar, and underemployment is going to soar. In other words, people from high-paying jobs are going to go into low-paying jobs. So whatever people can do, they need to reduce their debts and retain their incomes. That's the way they're going to see themselves through this.
OK. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.